Hey there, it's Justin. In this one, we're going to be taking a look at a startup that's leveraging Django and open source with a strategy that you might not have considered for your project yet. Now, the idea here is really exciting. I really like the concept of the startup as well. So it's not just about the technology, it's kind of a blend of those two things. So let's go ahead and take a look. Now, should you release your product's code open source? Now, initially you might say, no, absolutely not. But if we look at a few examples, you might change your mind. First of all, MongoDB, massive business. Elasticsearch, massive business. Cassandra, massive business, right? So there's a number of sources out there where they started as an open source tool and released it, got developers on board, and now have a managed service and are doing phenomenal with it. And we get to see this play out with a new startup called Baserow. Now, if you go to their website, you see two key phrases that stick out. That is open source and no code. Now, these phrases are on opposite ends of the same spectrum. Open source, of course, is for developers, those technical people who want to look at the code and run it and learn from it. And then there's the no code where, you don't want to look at the code. You just want it to run. You just want it to work in a lot of these automation workflows that require zero software development time, right? Or zero software developers. So it's really interesting dichotomy that's happening with Baserow, and I think they pull it off really well. Now, going with the open source side of things, they also help you host it, as in self-host it. You can deploy it wherever you want to. And this is very clear by the fact that Docker is well supported. So having Docker supported means you could pretty much run it on any infrastructure that's out there. Anything that's worth its salt should be able to run Docker just fine. And so if we look at the open source code itself, hey, what do you know? It's actually linked in the navigation. This is not very common that the open source code itself is right there when they have a managed offering like this. So if we look at the code itself, there's a lot of things going on here, but if we scroll down, what we see is the simple command to just run your own version of Baserow right now. Now, you can absolutely do this, and by all means, go ahead and do it and tell me what you think. But notice that it is a user interface on top of a database that has no solid structure. It's not exactly a spreadsheet, but it is a database that you can add rows and you can add all sorts of data in there with very, very little code, which is also fantastic. We'll get into that more in a little bit. But the idea of this open source part of things really, really makes it easy to learn what they did, how they execute this, how they are actually running this project. Now, being that I'm a Django developer, I see this backend directory here, and I want to see the actual Django code itself. I see SRC and Baserow. This is clearly the Django project, and it's laid out in a way that I'm not that familiar with. I don't actually lay out my Django projects this way. If you have learned from me, you would know that. But if you haven't, you can now really start to question, hey, why did they lay it out this way? What are the reasons for it? Should I dive into it? Should I check it out and see what's going on? And absolutely you should. You should definitely see, why is user in this one, in the API and views? And what we see here is very common Django related things. The Django REST frameworks here, Django itself, of course. We've got a number of other packages that are in here. And of course, if I go back a little bit, what I can also see is the actual requirements here. If I look at these requirements, I see that they use pip tools. I don't use pip tools. Maybe that's something I need to learn about. Maybe I need to spend more time with that. And we see that there's this base.txt. And now I can actually see all of the software that goes into this. Now, if you're not a software developer, you're like, okay, well, why are you showing me all this stuff? The point is that now we can uncover all of the different tools that actually build up the backend of Baserow, right? So you could emulate them, you could fork them, you could copy them. I mean, it's like all of those things are available to you given that it's open source. But the cool thing here is I notice a bunch of stuff that I use all the time. Photo 3, absolutely. Celery and Redis, absolutely. Django channels, definitely use that still too. Cryptography, for sure. Daphne, that's obviously for Django channels, as it says right here. We've got Django itself. It's got a lot of stuff related to Django. I already saw the Django REST framework, but there it is for sure. The Django REST framework Jot package. I mean, there's a lot of stuff going on here, which is really exciting to me as a Django developer, as someone who works a lot in open source, which is fantastic. It's cool to see a project of this size built in Django with, not that many packages as well. And it's not actually that much code either. So it's being executed really in my opinion, really well based off of what I see here and some of the tests that I've done. But their commitment to open source is very clear. It's very clearly something that Baserow is dedicated to. All right, so let's go ahead and actually take a look at the Baserow product before we do some demos related to using the product. Now, the first thing is go to this link right here and sign up. And after you do, you will actually be in something like this, right? So this is obviously my account with my own group in here named as CFE. Now, I have a database already in here, but let's go ahead and create a brand new one. I have the option to create from a template, and there's all kinds of templates in here that you might want to check out. I'm going to skip the templates for now, but the idea here is I can go ahead and create a new database, and I'll just call this demo, right? So the database is just this structure that holds, well, a bunch of different tables, right? So if I click on here, it's going to say it can't select this database because I don't have any tables yet. So in the sidebar here, I'll just go ahead and create a new table, and I'll call this demo DB. And I'll just start it with a new blank table. I'll go ahead and add it in here. And what I get is this, right? So it gives me some foundation of a table. It's not completely empty, but it's really easy to remove things. So if I wanted to remove a field, boom, it's gone, right? Or if I wanted to add one with all sorts of data types in here. And this to me is like a no-code part of things, right? So if I wanted to, let's say, use rating, the field name is rating and it's a field type of rating. We'll go ahead and hit create, and now I can actually rate these things in here right in the table itself, right? And of course I can add this value, I can add these values through code or no code as well, but it's right here in the database, and it's just a really easy way to keep track of all of these things, which is, I think, fantastic, right? So I can also export all of this data to something. So this is a really easy way to just manage data really, really quickly. So if you have like a big data set, for example, that you're working on and you're doing some machine learning, you could always just throw that data set in here and just store it on Baserow just for whenever you need to use it in the future, which is also very, very nice. Of course, that's what a database is for. But another cool thing is if we actually look at the locally hosted version, I am running this with this command right here, right? So this command will actually turn on Baserow for me. It'll get everything going. And just like on the managed version, actually on Baserow.io, well, my local version isn't a whole lot different. I have to actually still sign up for it, and then I log in, and what do you know? It's like identical. I go to create a new table here, and I'll call this demo2db, and I go ahead and hit start new table. Simple, same exact stuff. If I go ahead and create a new database here, actually let's create one from a template. I'll just grab this project tracker template, and I'll create a brand new database from that project tracker. And what do you know? It has all of that starter data in here. It gives me something to work off of. So this is actually really cool because it gives me basically everything that's in the managed version I can use on my own hosting, whether that's local or not. Now, typically speaking, with databases, having this kind of user interface for it would take a long time to actually put together. So the other thing though is whether it's locally hosted, self-hosted on a production service, or if it's the actual Baserow managed service, you can actually just create some API tokens in here to start actually working with the data that's in these various tables in this actual Baserow environment. So we'll actually take a look at that with a no-code or a low-code type workflow in just a moment. But just generally speaking here, the usage is very, very simple, and it's very easy to just spin something up inside of Baserow and start storing a lot of data. You can import it really easily. You can export it really easily. All right, so let's go ahead and take a look at a low-code demo using Baserow, Pipedream, and Typeform. Now, first and foremost, this is the type form that I have. It has 3 questions on it. The first one is, what's your name? And it's Justin Mitchell. And tell us what your needs are. Demo. And then how can we reach you? Some email, right? And hit submit. And if I go back into this, I now see that data, right? And of course, this is happening for several reasons. One, on Baserow itself, I actually created an API token. This API token is this one right here, and it allows me to modify and edit various things related to the different databases and the different tables, right? So I can be very specific about which key does what and to what, which is really nice, really, really clean as far as that is concerned. And then after I have that API key, I opened up this service called Pipedream. Pipedream will listen for triggers or anything happening on a Typeform account, right? Once something does happen there, then I need to prepare this data, clean it up, which is really just taking the Typeform form names, the field names, and mapping them to my Baserow field names, which is these right here. These three are mapped to these three right here. I also added extra data that doesn't actually matter, that Baserow just ignores. And then the final part is actually using Pipedream again and an HTTP request to actually send this data. So if you're not familiar with JavaScript, but you know Python really well, what you see here is a URL with a specific table ID. That table ID comes from right here. And then you just use the API token right there in that authorization. That's the token. And then we are going to use the application JSON content type, and then we'll just post that data in to that specific table. And it's going to be the data that came from the previous step, which is this data right here. So this integration is really, really simple to do. Granted, I'm flying through it. So if you want an in-depth tutorial on that one, please let me know in the comments. But the idea here is actually setting up this is so fast and so easy to do. If you've ever used Typeform before, you know how quick it is to actually create form data. Now, of course, if you actually changed the content fields here, if you will, if you changed any of those items, that would actually probably break your Pipedream workflow, which is just something you would pretty much understand when you actually created it. But just generally speaking, this is one of those low-code environments that it's really simple to get this data right in where you need it to go. Now, doing this with other kinds of tools is tricky. It's not as straightforward to just do all of this and make it work on an open source environment. Now, it's definitely a lot more simple than trying to do all of this integration with let's say a Postgres database itself, right? So if you just had a raw Postgres database, it would be actually pretty challenging to get all of these integrations working correctly and sustainably, and then also very no-code friendly or non-developer friendly as well. Now let's go ahead and use a code demo to work with Baserow itself. Now to do this, we're going to be using Python, and this is all of the code you'll really need to write. Yes, we'll have to add a data dictionary, but overall, this is it. It's very simple and incredibly effective. So let's go ahead and start filling this out. The first one is the table ID. Now there's a number of ways to get this actual ID itself. The easiest one is it's actually in the URL. It's this last ID here. Another way would be to go into the API tokens themselves. So if you see show databases, you can actually see the IDs written right there. So I'm going to go ahead and actually just grab the ID from the URL. That's the way I like to use it. So we save that, and then we want an API token. So I already have this PyDemo here thing. I'm going to go ahead and delete this one, and we'll create a new one called PyDemo. We'll go ahead and use this CFE group. I'll go ahead and create the token. Now, the first thing I want to do is break it. I want it to not work. So I'll use that demo database still, and I'll go ahead and turn all permissions off to this demo database. We're going to go ahead and create that token. Oops, we're going to not create a new token, but rather grab that demo token here with a copy there. And there we go. So there's our token, and we've got empty data, but let's go ahead and give this a shot. And I'll just run python demo.py, and I get no permission, right? So that's great. This is actually showing me that permissions are working right off the bat. So let's go ahead and turn these back on. And I actually probably don't need update or delete, but create and read will work. Python demo, I go ahead and run that. Notice it actually submits some sort of data in here. That doesn't give me a lot of information yet, but it does actually add a row in. So it's kind of hard to tell, but let's go ahead and do it a few more times. And what we see here is it's now actually adding a few rows in here of empty data. Now, this is good and bad, but in this case, it's actually really good because it's just going to allow me to just run requests and not necessarily worry too much about everything that's going on with those requests. So the idea here is I want to add in the name, notes, and active. I want to add those fields in. So in my data here, I'm going to go ahead and say name is just Justin. I'll go ahead and do notes, and I'll go ahead and say ABC123, and then I'll go ahead and add in one more thing of active. And this is a Boolean value, so I'm going to go ahead and say true. I'm going to go ahead and add in that old field I had before, which was rating. Let's go ahead and add that one in as well. And I'll hit create, and I'll just go ahead and say rating. And I'll give it a 0 to start. Okay, so if I run this now, same data, or actually new data, there's actually data being sent, but well, the row isn't actually giving me any data. I added the row, but it's not doing anything, right? So I got the ID right here. This is the ID as in what's over here. ID at 6, that's the response. We've got nothing. Okay, so this is actually pretty interesting, and how we would diagnose this is by going into the demo database itself, clicking on View API Docs. This will actually give me, well, the demo database table documentation, and I can see in here the actual fields that this database has. This is fantastic. It's like so easy to figure out everything that's going on here. So I don't actually have to do additional authentication or test this API itself. It's actually filling out a lot of this data for me, including the request itself and various samples in here that you might end up using, right? Of course, you need to still put in your API token, but that's just the general idea here in relation to getting the field data. Now, of course, these fields are, well, I want to use not this weird field underscore with some ID in here. I want to use the actual names, the actual field names that I gave it in the database itself, right? So I want to use these fields instead. Now, that's actually a really simple fix. At the end of our URL here, I just use a URL parameter called user underscore field underscore names being true. That's it. Now this data will actually run correctly, and the response will actually correspond to that data as well, which is also great, right? So now if I look in here, what do you know? Here's that data coming through. Now, rating itself has a value between 0 and 5. And the way you would find this out is twofold. One is by using the documentation, or two, you can just export all of this data right here, right? Fantastic. That's super, super simple. Now, the other cool thing about this is there are webhooks that we can use. I can actually send webhooks when data is coming through. So when it's created, I can actually send this somewhere else, right? So if I have a whole nother service or an actual application that's running off of this stuff, I can 100% have this payload come through, and here's the data and how it actually comes through, which I think is incredibly developer friendly with how these values come through. It's not that weird field name and all that. It's just like actually the values, which is pretty neat. A lot of really well thought out pieces of how you would actually end up working with this data, which is great. But the key thing is how simple this API is. It's incredibly simple just to add data. It's also just as simple to extract data, to get that data itself, which we could try it out. So I'm going to go ahead and just do get now with no JSON data. But I'm just going to go ahead and get it with the request itself, like that, and we'll run it again. And now I got all of the data that's coming through in a manner that makes a ton of sense as well, right? So I actually really, really appreciate how thought out that API has been, and just switching different tables and adding different fields makes it really, really, really easy to work with, and something that I recommend that you do in a number of your projects. Right, so during my research using Baserow, I actually found this repository called Awesome Self-Hosted. It looks like there's a Reddit community as well. The general idea of this, or the ethos, seems to be, hey, if you want to host your own applications to build your services and your businesses, this is a great place to start at, actually. So if you're like, oh, I need some better automation tools, here's a bunch in here. Actions Flow, a free Zapier alternative for developers with Docker and Node.js, right? That's pretty cool. Hey, what do you know? There's Baserow right there. That's also pretty cool. Nice and listed. Notice the source code's there, just like many of these other ones. Fantastic, right? And so we think about this in terms of like, hey, well, maybe I can learn from these projects, or maybe they can help my project in some form or fashion. And then also, if you have your own open source tool, you can just submit it here and see if you can garner some developer friendliness and some traction among developers, and maybe be listed on here, something like this. Look at this episode, self-hosted TV show episode tracker using Django and Bootstrap. Hey, I talk about those things all the time. Hey, a face recognition system that provides a REST API for face recognition. What do you know? That's free. We just need to run it, and it uses Docker. Pretty cool. So there's all sorts of tools like this, like Baserow, where it's just complements to the things that you may already be doing. So definitely check out this repository when you get a chance. Now, thanks so much for watching this one, and thanks to Baserow for helping make this happen. Now, the key part of all of this, the thing that inspires me a lot and also helps me reinforce the notion of you should learn front end, you should learn back end, and that's because Bram, the actual founder of Baserow, did that. He started from, well, his own ideas, and he actually put Baserow into action on his own, building the first version, open sourcing it, and doing all that. Now he's got a team of 10 people. I think they're well funded. I think they have a few jobs. They're going to be hiring like crazy because this is an amazing tool, especially when you compare it to some of the alternatives out there that do similar things. I actually much prefer Baserow, and the fact that they use Django and Docker and all of these open source things are just like so cool. So anyways, if you enjoyed this one, if you like Baserow, please check them out. Let them know that I sent you. Let me know in the comments if you want to see more in-depth tutorials with Baserow and Python, or like Fast API or even Node.js. Just let me know, because I do want to do more stuff with Baserow. I think it's such a compelling project itself. So thanks again for watching, and I look forward to seeing you guys next time.